Hey everyone! We're on week 4 of our class, and today we're focusing on lesson 8, and specifically we're looking at Schramm Park today. But while we're doing that, I'm going to just do a brief introduction on stratigraphy, or specifically lithostratigraphy, and on some of the features that you're going to be looking at in Schramm Park. So first and foremost, already in the lesson, you should have been asked to make observations of an image of the Schramm Park outcrop here. And so I just wanted to show you some of the things that I'm seeing here and what other geologists might be looking for. So some of the observations you might have made are that there are distinct layers that are forming, and you can see those layers because there's some sort of difference in the material that's there. Now, what you can probably see from this photo is that most of the differences are in the color or the thickness of the layers, as well as kind of the texture that you're seeing. So what I've done here in the red is just outline some of those layers. Now what I see, and I've been to Schramm Park before, so I highly recommend that if you live near the Omaha area, to take that 15-20 minute drive down to Schramm Park and to check out this geologic outcrop yourself. Short trip, doesn't have to last long, but you should definitely go try to check out some of the features that we'll talk about today. So first and foremost, the thicker layers that are slightly tan colored, those are going to be our limestone layers. And then the reddish almost layers in this photo are a type of weathering that's occurring, but you can tell that the texture is a little different. And in those redder eroded layers, that softer material, that's going to be our fine-grained shale. Before we get a little bit further into Schramm Park itself, just want to review what stratigraphy is. So stratigraphy is the branch of geology and earth science that deals with the arrangement and succession of rock strata. So we've already learned the geologic principles used in the study of stratigraphy. We've looked at superposition, where the oldest layers are on the bottom, the younger layers are at the top. We've looked at original horizontality and lateral continuity, and also at cross-cutting relationships, where any material that cuts across material must be younger than the material it cuts across. Now, stratigraphy itself can be broken up into different branches. So we talked a little bit about biostratigraphy and how you can use fossils to relatively date rocks. Well, lithostratigraphy works in a very similar way. So lithostratigraphy is using distinctive rock characteristics to define rock strata in space and time. The basis of this is called a formation. So a formation then is again a distinctive rock layer with unique characteristics. And like geologic time, lithostratigraphic units are divided into a hierarchical scale. So in this case, we have our base layers which are formations, but multiple formations can make up a group. And formations can also be subdivided into members. So our largest would be our group, our intermediate size would be formation, and our smaller sizes would be our members. This is going to be important when you do your ashfall lesson this week and throughout the semester, so make sure you know that groups are made up of formations, and formations can also be made up of distinctive layers called members. Here is how that works for Schramm Park. So we have the Stanton Formation at the base, which is divided up into 3 different members, the Eudora Shale at its base, the Kiewitz Shale bed above a very thin limestone layer known as the Dyson Hollow bed, and then above that Kiewitz Shale is the Stoner Limestone. And those are all members of the Stanton Formation, as I already said. Now above the Stanton Formation is the Rock Lake Formation. The Rock Lake Formation is not divided into members, but it's a very soft, shaley unit, as you can see in the image by the texture. And then finally at the top we have the South Bend Formation, and that is divided up into 2 different members, the Little Caw limestone at its base and the Gretna Shale at the top. You do not need to remember every single division of this for the class, but I just wanted to emphasize how these formations are subdivided into members very often in geologic studies. Now, I just mentioned that some of our units here are made up of two different types of sedimentary rocks. So the Schramm Park sedimentary rocks are mainly shales and limestones. So to review from last week, shales are a clay-sized grain material that have been cemented or lithified together. At Schramm Park, they're typically a grayish to red color, and they're made up of softer material, so it breaks down pretty easily. Limestone, on the other hand, here ranges from micrite, which is very fine-grained carbonate. Remember that limestones are made of calcium carbonate. And then to fossiliferous or coarse-grained carbonate. These limestones are typically varying colors here. They can be tan, gray, reddish, and they're harder materials, so they form the ledgy layers that you're looking at in those photos. So on the left is just an image of a gray shale, and on the right is an image of a very fossiliferous tan limestone. And we'll talk about what those fossils in there are in a moment. So we're going to go through the Schramm Park fossils here. I just want to do a brief explanation. You'll also be reading about these fossils in the rest of the lesson. So here's a list of them. We've got our crinoids, sea urchins, bryozoans, brachiopods, rugose corals, and fusulidids or foraminifera. So let's take each of these in turn. So the first of these that you might find at Schramm Park are crinoids. Crinoids are from a larger group called echinodermata. They're filter-feeding organisms that consist of a holdfast, which is basically almost like a root structure that keeps them supported on the ground, a column or a stalk, and this column is made up of numerous tiny discs. And when it's alive, there's soft parts that are holding those discs together. But when it dies, those soft parts decay and the discs fall apart. At the top, there are some pinnules or feather-like features, and those feather-like features grab onto plankton, and that's how they filter feed. So as you can see from the photo in the center, that is an alive crinoid, so they still are alive, although there would be different species than what lived in the past. And then here on the right are two examples of how they might be expressed as fossils. So in the top, these are the broken apart discs that would form the column. And in the bottom, those are columns or parts of columns that remained intact and stayed together after they were fossilized. Now, sea urchins are also part of the same group as crinoids, so they're very closely related. Again, so from echinodermata. And sea urchins, like crinoids, are still alive. They're spiny little invertebrates, meaning they don't have a vertebra, that live on the seafloor. They're very rare fossils at Schramm Park, so be happy if you find something, and you typically find them as spines. So that's pictured in the bottom with that guy there, or girl, that has their hand filled with little spines. Those are our sea urchins. But they can also be found as whole molds, and that's shown in the top right corner. The next type of fossil you might find in some of these limestone layers are bryozoans. It's from the phylum Bryozoa. They also are filter-feeding organisms, but they're colonial invertebrates. So what that means is they form this kind of calcium carbonate colony that's filled with little organisms called zooids. Those zooids are pictured on the left, so bryozoans also have extant or living relatives. So this photo on the left is of living bryozoans or zooids. And then on the right, these are some fossil bryozoans. So they can form colonies that branch or are slightly massive, as in the top photo. But they can also form these beautiful lacy structures, which is shown in the bottom right with a penny for scale, so you can see how big their structures are. Brachiopods are another group that you might find at Schramm Park, so if you're looking, take a look for these shelly organisms. These are also filter-feeding bottom dwellers that live in ocean environments. You can see their modern relatives, so there are some modern relatives today on the left in that image, but they don't have a very diverse group today. They were extremely diverse in the Paleozoic. And they're different than clams, so just a note, we'll take a look at some clams and bivalves in the future for this class, but brachiopods are actually not really related or not very closely related to clams. Their shells are a little bit different. So here are some pictures of fossilized brachiopods on the right. There are different kinds, different shapes, different structures, and they're actually really good index fossils for telling what time period geologically you're in. Another group that you might find here are the rugose corals. So rugose corals are part of the phylum Cnidaria, which includes all types of corals, including scleractinian corals, which are the ones that are alive today. These ones, however, are part of the order Rugosa, and they're an extinct group of horn-shaped corals, and they actually live solitary, so they're not colonial like modern corals. They filter feed, similar to bryozoans. There's a reconstruction of this extinct group shown on the left. You can see the solitary horn-shaped coral and the organism coming out of it, kind of like a sea anemone, you might imagine them like. And then on the right is a fossil of these rugose corals. So they have this very distinct horn shape, cone shape, and then if you were to look at them from the top down, they would have these nice septa. So that's something else you might see in the Schramm Park rocks. And then finally, the most abundant fossil in some of these layers, you should definitely be able to find these if you're a fossil hunter, are fusulinids. These are a type of foraminifera, which is a single-celled planktic oceanic organism. So it lives and floats in the deeper water. It produces these carbonate shells, also known as tests, and these are actually huge for foraminifera. They are giants. They're the size of rice grains. Typically they're microscopic, so you can't see them unless you look at them under a microscope, or they look like very, very fine sand grains. But these ones are kind of football shaped. So on the right is an image of what their tests or their shells might look like. They have these chambers inside that the organism itself, the single-celled organism, lives in. And then on the left is just a photo of some of these rice grain fusulinids in the rock itself. So now you should be asking yourself, what do all these organisms have in common, and what does that mean for the environment that deposited these rock strata? So continue on reading through your Top Hat lesson today, and then at the end you'll be asked to interpret what type of environment the strata at Schramm Park may have been deposited in, based on the lithostratigraphy as well as the fossils that are found in there. We'll talk about this much later on again when we're time traveling through Nebraska, but just begin to think about what these layers mean.